What if the gods of ancient mythology were never gods at all, but something else, something alien? From Gnostic Archons to the Mesopotamian Anunnaki, from the Greek daimons and current UFO whistleblowers, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. The idea that humanity may be inside a system, a farm, designed to harvest, manipulate, and control human emotion. And the strangest part, the CIA may have accidentally confirmed the very thing that these ancient mystics were talking to us about. It's called the gateway process. So tonight on Chasing the Past, whether literal beings or metaphors for unconscious control systems, we shall be attempting to connect everything we currently know about the modern UAP phenomenon with all the things mystical from the ancient past. Buckle up, we're about to go light speed. Welcome back, guys. I wanted to do this one because if you're like me, you get, enthralled in all this mystical, traditional, books to read and things to find and people to watch and do all these things. I've never felt any of this stuff. I've never gone through any of this, but I had this weird spark that just went, I've never talked about a potential for maybe like the downside, right? Like there's always a downside to something. And so as we're going through some of these, yes, they're very cool, but I was kind of trying to figure out if some of the things we've learned have these downsides. And then I started realizing these sound a lot like this modern UAP phenomenon going on. And I've done some videos prior to this with the same idea, but it's going to be more specific, like the Archons, and they're going to be in this video too. But in order to understand maybe the potential, or at least the attempt to understand all the potential that could be and is, we should go through some of these downsides, if you will. Or, just like the intro, is a control system, perhaps. Or, we'll get into it, right? We're going to go through the gateway process. We're going to go through Jacques Vallée. We're going to go through, Monroe Institute, Robert Monroe, Loosh, right? All those things, but also kind of keeping it in this bubble of maybe in the ancient past they had the same thing. Maybe the language is different. Maybe, well, I know this for a fact, the gateway process, they did say, was kind of like the modern reinterpretation of what they already knew back in the day, maybe with just updated language, right? Even the methods and the practices and things that they were doing are from these ancient mythological ideas. So we're going to walk through those. So we're going to go through, I always thought of them as like maybe lesser beings, or beings that were not, if you want to arc it into, a category of like God or the all or the universe or whatever this big grand scale item is, like what are these lesser beings underneath it, right? Maybe they're emanations, maybe they are pieces of the universe that relate back to the whole, and that's where these things come from. But the things we're going to go through in this section, it's going to be Gnosticism, right? It's going to be the Archons. We're going to go through ancient Mesopotamia, right? Maybe the Anunnaki. And then we're going to go through, again, back to this Greek world of like maybe a parasitic spirit or these Greek daimons, right? Which we get demon from, but it doesn't have the same negative, play with it. And then I found this one, which I thought was interesting, which is in ancient Mexico, they have one called the Flyers, or the Toltec, shamanic, mud shadows. So I thought that was interesting too. And then to keep it light and fun, maybe some mystical solutions, or like to prevent some of these things that we've learned about can kind of work in our favor, right? So if this is some modern control system or something negative, right, there are some positives and some benefits. So we'll start with it, right? You guys have probably already heard me do it, but if you're new, thanks for being here. let's do a quick walk down ancient history lane. So in Gnosticism, you have the Archons, which are, it's one of the most famous examples, right? One of the videos I did, Jason Giorgiani, is super fascinating to listen to and to go over this, but it's these Gnostic sects in like the 1st and 2nd century. And so the idea is this material world, right, was not created by the one, this force that connects it all, but by like a lesser, like ignorant or malicious, in this case, like God figure, right? And that's this demiurge, right? And again, later on, you get that tied into like Yahweh and this kind of idea. But the demiurge then is served, I guess, by these rulers, these Archons. And so these are these physical, like intermediary, or I guess interdimensional, if we're talking UAP, like beings who then like use, feed, and manipulate human emotion and energy to like kind of keep things in balance. And so their idea of their tactic here would be, if you're, practicing Gnosticism, or you're a Gnostic, or you want to, Gnosis is the word for knowledge, right? So if you understand that they use these religions, these social laws, the, death itself, right? Oh, I'm afraid to die, right? To keep the souls, right? These divine sparks, like trapped in this repeating cycle to then feed off of the energy, feed off the emotion, right? Your whole goal would then to not give humans the ability to understand. You essentially keep them in conflict to not let them realize our divine potential. Because if we realize the divine potential, well, then we're not going to get recycled back into a system that they need to feed off of, if that makes sense. And so an interesting key part of that I didn't include here, but it does mean that even if you want to get down deep in the weeds with like the demiurge creating this world and then creating these rulers, these Archons, right? Well, then if we have this divine potential to step above, then it means we can be superior to that of these Archons that we can't understand. And so that is a cool, like, it's an empowering feeling too, right? Like, oh, we can definitely handle this, right? We're not just some like small, tiny, insignificant thing. We're important, and they know we're important. And again, that goes back to when we go to way back, which is, these are just the kind of broad strokes too. So like the Mesopotamian Anunnaki is very popular in the UAP, phenomenon world, and, the Sitchin's work, which I've referenced many times, but it's the relationship between humans and these God figures, right? And, it's very obvious, even in like, I'm pretty sure it's Zachariah Sitchin who mentions that they made humans to mine for the gold, and then, so it's very transactional, right? And, it's transactional, and exploits the human potential, and we become more of like a commodity rather than, we become slaves, essentially. But they didn't want to do this work, so then, okay, how do we not do this work? Well, we create something that then does it for us. What is that? Well, you guessed it, that'd be us. Not a great story, too. But there were also these things of like constant sacrifices, too. So like the smoke, which I found interesting, because that's also probably where it gets tied into Gnosticism with Yahweh. Because you have in the Torah, right, you have some of these burnt offerings. And when I started reading them, if you look at it, like the NRSV, I don't have the updated edition, but I have the one they did prior to that one. And in these passages, right, I always wondered why the smoke of these burnt offerings was like described in detail. And, in the Anunnaki tradition, it's more of like a sustenance almost, right? And in Genesis, Genesis, right, especially in Exodus, when they're walking through, you get these, it says the smell pleases God, right? And that threw me for a loop. Like, why does the smell, what is this? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me, right? God wouldn't have a smell, in at least our modern interpretation, God wouldn't smell anything. So why does this smell so important? And then now we get to these, and I'm like, I understand. So, in this view, right, these modern interpretations or even esoteric interpretations, right, it suggests that these were technically a physical being kind of having to like pose as spiritual icons of some kind. And by doing this and making them seem above us, right, keeping us kind of as this slave idea, then we become a compliant workforce, right, which in the modern day feels pretty easy to do, pretty easy to lock us into being a compliant workforce. But that's kind of a very broad overview of Mesopotamian Anunnaki, right? Now this daimons, this parasitic spirit from the Greek, really had me, because again, I knew that that's where demon came from, but I also knew that it didn't have the same negative connotation that we have later developed now, right? It didn't mean that back then, right? Like Socrates had his own daemon, right? And it was more of like a broad term too, like spirits or like, lower spirits could be bad, and then these higher ones that can, be with you and work with you, right? Like it's kind of more broad stroke, kind of like how the jinn, right? And like, I guess Middle Eastern Islamic thought could be good or bad, right? They could be either or. It's kind of like, what do they feel like doing? What do they feel like doing, right? And, there were a lot of these Neoplatonic philosophers who described these guys, these entities almost, as like disguising themselves. And they used this ancestral or like the form of gods, right, to like clothe themselves almost. And so the whole point was they craved these, again, back to animal sacrifice, but this animal sacrifice was like some type of energy, right? And this vital breath of humans, which is like the pneuma, the spirit, right? The wind, right? This thing that makes all of us alive, right? And so to convince everybody else, to convince them like, oh no, we're totally cool, they would do like minor miracles, maybe even prophesy, right? Just to keep, the human practitioner hooked, and then you're still feeding them, right? You're still feeding from them, right? Maybe you're giving something, which is kind of like this. I've always thought about this too, right? Deception doesn't always have to be obvious, right? You have to have discernment. I think a lot of us in this modern world right now don't have a whole bunch of discernment to tell the difference, right? If there's a miracle, there's a prophecy, like, oh my God, like you're it, right? No one's taking a step back. So this is why I also wanted to make this video, because I think it's really important that we attach ourselves to that idea, right? Always question, right? Develop yourself, build yourself, like make the mind a fortress almost. And then you'll be able to maybe not fall for something so easily, or maybe you'll be able to tell, in this case, the difference between, oh, that's a lower being and this is a higher being. It's very different, right? And so keep that in mind. Now, I am going to do an entire long run on the flyers because I have never heard of this before and I love it. Yeah. So these accounts, they draw on these deep-seated Mesoamerican like shamanic traditions, right? And again, the mud shadows or the flyers. So they are described as ancient inorganic beings that gave humans their mind, in quotes. So this is interesting too, because a lot of things, especially in, it's Mesopotamia, right? I covered that in the video too. There's these beings, just like the ones in Mesopotamia, there's this glow, like this light, this awareness, right? This glow of awareness that they want to consume, right? Maybe you would call it an aura, right? The human aura. So it keeps, that's kind of like their food source. It keeps them steady. So these flyers installed their own belief systems, and then they put ego-driven fears into human beings. So the point is that, okay, human conflict, greed, religious fervor are seen as some type of an agitation that they create. And by creating that, these beings then make energy more flavorful, which this whole thing sounds very familiar on a ton of different accounts. You as the viewer, you can pick which one you want. But I think if there's something universal that we can pull different things from, well, maybe in translation it gets lost, but like at least the core root might be the same. So those are kind of a general idea of where we're going into when we look at this modern UAP phenomenon now. So before we get there, let's go through these solutions of prevention, which would be something mystical, right? Maybe it's the two that I thought were important would be knowledge, right? Learning that discernment, so gnosis and like sobriety. So the common defense across all practices was not worship, it was discernment. So then silence, right? Practicing this mental silence. And I will admit that is very difficult. It's very difficult to just be quiet in your own head, to meditate, to take time away from something, right? Like right there. Like, okay, I had things in my head going on. So some of these I'm actually working with you as we learn, like, I might try that. So practicing this mental silence distinguishes your own thoughts from maybe thoughts that you are receiving or have been installed in some way or given to you in some way. Or you'll be able to tell between the two. And so asceticism was another one. So the whole point for asceticism really is like you're reducing the volatility, right? Your emotional volatility that they need for food, right? So essentially it's like you're not leaking out any energy here, right? You're like holding it all in. You're controlling these emotions. You're controlling the thoughts in your head. And then they have nothing to eat from. And so once you kind of get those, then you're able to like see the deceiver, right? So then if you can tell the difference, then the power's gone, right? So now we're going to get into some of the UAP gateway project stuff, which might get a little intense, I would say. But keep these in mind, right? There is some type of prevention or some type of practices that even in the ancient past they were doing, just like we can do now, to prevent if this is the literature, if this is what's going on, if this is the truth, right? Yeah, I'm not saying it. There's no definitives in this show, okay? Right? We are going through material that is curious and fun, but if it is true, these good to keep in mind. The whole key to this video that made me want to go, yeah, we could probably attack that together as a group is I've noticed that in the UAP circles, UFO circles, right? Like it's less about craft anymore, right? The nuts and bolts are kind of like, we already know about that stuff. Like, cool, right? But instead now we're moving towards like consciousness-driven things. We're moving towards technology of the mind, right? And so I think in the same wavelength that we as a society are moving in that direction, right now the UAP phenomenon is building up that same steam. And many of these whistleblowers that I've watched the hearings, right? Everyone knows David Grush. I mean, like, there's a lot that I just really wanted to know because that would be cool. Like, it's never been outside my wheelhouse to not think that aliens were real, even if I was hyper religious, right? There was always a possibility. And some people, they just can't. But I've noticed that with instead of, maybe extraterrestrial or like, the ET with the finger, right? It's more like it's interdimensional, right? There are layers of dimensions in reality that we may not be able to perceive or have access to, but these things can walk through them. They can move through them in a way. And the crazy part would be, well, that means they're kind of here all along, wouldn't it? Right? Because it's the analogy that I like is you as a human being, you're looking down, right, at the ants. They're walking, right, two-dimensional, right? You're above them, 3D, right? If I'm looking down, like you're just one layer up and you're looking down, the ants don't really know you're there. They probably see the shadow that you project from the sun on the sidewalk, right? But they don't know that it's you making that shadow. And, you can interact with them, but the ants have no idea that you're there. I'm not trying to compare ourselves to ants. I just think I need to like physically see it or like put an analogy in my head. That's a good one to look at this, right? The good news is we're better than the ants. So if we learn, maybe through gnosis, maybe through studying some of these things, we can discern the difference. And so instead of just falling for the mask, I guess, it could be technology, so less nuts and bolts and more like maybe a spiritual element to reality that we don't get is being controlled rather than making a craft. Then we can kind of remove the mask and we can kind of see underneath it. And, there were a couple things, right? So in this specter, this realm of UAP, we have, this demonic hypothesis, which is usually tied to the Collins elite, which is it's within the Pentagon and the UK Ministry of Defense. But this group is kind of comparing them to like biblical demons, or in our case, since we're going through them, more like the Archons, these Gnostic Archons. So they're less alien and they're more interdimensional negative demons or Archons. So, and again, we have the same idea. The belief is that they feed on soul energy, which again, Loosh is usually, Robert Monroe. Usually in these esoteric circles, it's called Loosh, right? The soul energy. And so this gray alien that we get, for example, would be the mask, right? To deceive us because they're very almost like there's a trick to it, right? Like they feel like physical, like they're material, but from experience or accounts, they're very, very, like stone cold, right? There's like no emotion, there's nothing there. And so this goal here in this Collins elite, circle here is that this is like techno spirituality, right? So it leads us more to this soul trap and this harvesting idea rather than referring to the old ancient past of these like traditional protection systems, which can be practiced, and we already went through some of those. Jacques Vallée calls this the control system, right? And if you don't know Dr. Jacques Vallée, legendary researcher, he's the French guy from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, right? So that's who inspired that character, which I thought was fascinating. And I will say, I've learned most of the interdimensional hypothesis, nodes of information from Jacques Vallée. And so these Vallée notes that the behavior of these alien beings, right, whether it's, abduction, paralysis, these bright lights immediately, sexual experimentation in most cases, right, is very identical to ancient stories of fairies, elves, and then demons and medieval folklore. And so his proposal is that these UAPs are like a form of, they're like a thermostat. Like in this control system, they're like checking the temperature, right? So they're manipulating beliefs over periods of time, centuries, I guess, in this case, to steer human evolution in a specific direction that benefits them instead of us, right? Which does remind me of this Archon idea we just went over, where we need to tell you you're not important and look at us, right? Which is, I've never understood. That was something I never really understood when I would go to church. It's like, okay, so you're telling me that I have free will and can do all this stuff, but also I have none of those things. And it's like, oh, can I act on that thing in my life? No, we should pray about that. And I'm like, I get the idea of slowing down, right? Like, I know that sometimes we have to stop moving, right? So stop moving so fast. But I think, never mind. But I think that's an understatement on your potential, on mine, on all of humanity's potential. Because instead of taking it into your own hands, right, which you have complete capability to do, you're now pushing it to something that is like, oh, we'll give it back to him. And it's like, that does feel easier, and it does make things more difficult. I've been there. Because, with things that just happen in life now, they feel different, right? Emotional weight is heavier, right? There's things but it's building me, right? It's building me as a person. And I'm choosing to take those on rather than to essentially send it away and then ignore it and be like, well, I guess it's just not the way the cards are supposed to go, right? That that feels very much like this control system, this thing that they want to keep it locked into. And, Jesse from American Alchemist, he had the guy who worked with Tom DeLonge in, To the Stars Academy. I can't think of his name. I'll put it up here. Here's a picture. Peter Leventa. There we go. Right? And so their ideas really mirror the Anunnaki and these Gnostic myths. So he argues, they call them the others, but these gods, thrive on human conflict and this negative emotion. And so the purpose is that, well, we already know the purpose, but their tactic, I guess, would be to start different religious and nationalistic movements to like separate humanity, to ensure the division and keep them tribe-like, warlike, and then keep this agitation going. So then they describe it as more of an energetic frequency as well, which I thought was cool, because we were talking about frequency and different things in the earlier video where they can somehow consume on that, right? And maybe because we don't eat vibrations, we don't see it as food, but who knows, right? Again, Robert Monroe, he has the Loosh. So his OBEs, his out-of-body experiences, were heavily studied, and this is where we move from these ideas and the whistleblowers into the CIA a little bit. So these were the gateway process in these declassified CIA files from the 80s. And so Monroe claimed these entities he would encounter with kind of viewed Earth like a farm, and this Loosh was what they were harvesting, this high potency energy produced by human beings during moments of like really intense, moments of the strongest negative emotions, so like pain, fear, but then also you can drive it up even farther with religious ecstasy. And this idea is very Greek, it's very Mesopotamian, right? The gods smell and feed off of these energies, sacrifices, all of these different things. So when you get down to when you go, okay, well, what is the modern UAP phenomenon? What do they say this is? What I've heard a lot, again, we've already talked about David Grush too, but they're biological entities that appear like manufactured or cloned. Like they're just putting like suits on, and they're just putting something inside of it to like control, which is the very stone cold look, this very like no emotion driven type idea, which is very Gnostic, because these Archons have no spirit, right? So at least not of their own, right? We have ones of our own. They do not. So these are essentially, like, comparing both, it's like an inorganic shell, right? That houses this Archon, who then comes down to interact with us in our world, right? This interdimensional idea, right? And I think it's funny that all of this is not, when I started digging into it, it's not new. Like these are very descriptive things. We just like label them mythology or like religion. But these ideas have some value and tie into all these different practices or books or different ideas of experiences people have had in the ancient past. And I do not think we should just throw that out the window, right? There's, like, if I'm doing something and I'm writing something down, like, there's usually a purpose. There's something I'm doing. I need to put it down on paper, right? I'm not going to forget it. Was it a moment that I needed to? Instead of paper, I'm also doing this, right? Like, it's like every video is like a book of new information, a page in that book. And we're like building this up. So, because they're important, right? So I don't think we should just completely discredit these things. But so I've also heard, I just put a little blurb in here before we get to the gateway process, but there's something called the ninth node, which revolves around like perception. So the ninth node is a frequency, like just outside of our visual spectrum. So this kind of gives into the idea that maybe they're here right now. They're doing their stuff right now. They filter it down. Maybe they're not from another planet. They're just here all the time, We just have they're outside of visual spectrum, or they're outside of our perception, right? And so when they do show up, it's more like a hunter putting on camouflage, right? Like you're in the forest, right? Maybe the animal cannot see you, but you are there, right? You're going to choose when to interact. Maybe you're going to let that one go, right? It's very much, these are all very relatable things, at least to me. And if there's anything you have too, go ahead and put that down at the bottom, because as much on this that I've learned, I still would like to know more. So, moving into the gateway process, 1983. So these documents, right, were, I'll go there, right? This report was tasked with using science, again, quantum physics, biomedical models, that explain how human consciousness can leave the physical body and interact with other dimensions. I think it's interesting that they are talking about other dimensions in 1983. Like, that seems like, what? Like, we just found out about that. Nope. Been around for a while. Turns out they're finger on the pulse, the CIA. So, I would hope so. They probably knew what I had for breakfast. Answer was nothing. I was very busy this morning. Anyway, so these sections in this document, right off the gate, holographic universe theory, and then this term clicking out. So right away in the document, it says the universe is this vast hologram, right? So our brains act as a receiver that translate a chaotic sea of frequencies into solid reality, which again doesn't seem so far-fetched with like quantum mechanics. So what we call physical reality essentially is just like a frequency barrier, right? So to escape this barrier, this frequency lock, right, there's something called a hemisync, right? So audio frequencies that synchronize both hemispheres of the brain. And so with this, you can click out of this local frequency, and then you can move your consciousness, right, to essentially like the speed of light. And then you enter this realm where there's no time, there's no space, nothing happens. You've clicked out of that barrier. And so in this training for the gateway process, there's these shadow entities, right? And these are in Monroe's journals, but they begin to, these beings, like, they see them as they vibrate out of their body. So, like, they're around. So, like, the threshold is like, okay, we're going to go into, like, moving out of this frequency. Well, then you see these shadow figures. And, again, it's almost like this guardian almost, right? Like, it reminds me of the ancient mystical accounts of people who are, like, at the threshold, and they're like, hey, what are you doing? Right, don't come in here. You're like, oh, okay. Well, I think I want to go that way. They're like, nope. Hey, hold on. But the thing you have to do, which I think emotion is important in most of these, right? You have to stay calm, right? You need to, instead of tapping into the negative ones, the really strong ones. So fear, super strong, right? Like pain, right? Like, oh no, what's going to happen, right? Those that very strong emotions that act. We all act on those, right? But only because they're so strong. So instead, you have to go to the other side. What's the other side? It's love, compassion, a resonant frequency that is not in this negative category, right? So then, these things can't feed off you any longer. You're in tune with love and resonance, not fear and pain, right? And so, okay, what were they harvesting? We already talked about Loosh, right? So Monroe describes this realization he had out of body. So he says he claimed he saw pipes or conduits attached to human beings, funneling this emotional energy, this Loosh, toward like collectors, right? And these collections are like in a higher frequency, like just above ours, but the energy is, again, most potent during fear, suffering, and death. And like, again, we are like intense, like religious devotion or fervor too. So this is kind of like honestly, it's like the smoking gun for the Archon idea, these Gnostic Archons, and that above us that we cannot perceive is some type of farm. And that farm is designed to produce the emotional output required for consuming this loosh. And when we get to, what's that new movie? I just forgot. The Program? Something, right? One of those, he was on Joe Rogan, but like him and others, they talk about like these beings are always here. And like maybe we're just tuned like away from them. Like we just can't perceive them. And so if we get past this frequency filter, if we move into a place of love as we go through these, into essentially timeless space, then they become more like these static shadow beings don't really hold any like solid thing in our world, right? They just can come in and out. And so I guess I don't want to tie this in together, but we're just going to hit it right out the gate with like, why would you keep this a secret? Well, okay, hold on. To me, I kind of agree with this, right? Because the minute that I saw the UAPs and they go into the water, right? They just splash. Maybe they even fade through trees. It does feel very holographic, right? Maybe there are some actual nuts and bolts, right? Maybe there is a craft that we have, probably. But also, Diana Pasulka calls them donations. So if the donation, right? Remember, deception doesn't always have to be obvious. Maybe they do give you a craft, but maybe it's kind of like a puzzle. Like, hey, we just built this thing and we made it like way better than anything you can make. Take this, go study it. But really how we operate is nothing physical at all, right? We can just go through the spectrum. We can like vibrate through things, kind of like how the Flash, if he runs fast enough, he could technically vibrate through the wall, right? His cells vibrate, he can run through the wall without damaging it, right? Kind of sounds like that's what's going on. Maybe you need a craft. Maybe you don't even need one at all, right? This could be an entire level, like it's all speculation, but an entire level of things that are just super high strangeness, especially when it comes to our visual perception, which is, needless to say, very limited. Now, if this is all true, right, I understand why it would be a secret, because it wouldn't just be as simple as like, oh, there's alien life. It then becomes super dangerous because there's also nothing we could do about it, right? We can kind of work hard at practicing it. We can do some things to like bind us to ourselves, realize divine potential, and not have to fall for this trap. But the implications, right, on this bullet list, religion then is a tool, right? It then is a spiritual system used to like manage you, right? But it's not even created by the one that you're supposed to be talking to or worshiping, right? It's all designed for a specific emotional state of you, which is to be able to feed off this like fervor that you have for like this devotion. It also means death is not the end, but it's also not great. Very Gnostic. It's a trap. Admiral Akbar. It's a trap. But some talk about this light at the end of the tunnel, right? Jason Giorgiani again says this too, that this is that trap, right? That light is where you're supposed to go to it. Then you go back to this farm, wiped completely, and then you get reincarnated back. And, that sucks. Like, that's not a fun realization either. So if that was what happened, we would lose our mind. So I would understand if you wanted to keep that under wrap. And the only way that you don't get caught in it is if you become unfeedable, right? You become, but see, to me, the thing I'm having the most struggle with now, and maybe you are right now too, hearing all this stuff, is you can do practices to not be feedable, but also I feel like by doing that, you're not really having the fullest potential of the human experience. So now I'm having this balancing act or I'm having to, oh, maybe I can do some of these practices. Oh, but then if I do that completely, then like family life falls away, work life, right? Like all these things just fall away that I really, really love. And that's kind of a conflict for me, side note. But the CIA themselves do also have a specific technique, right? And it's used for people who are practicing, doing this out-of-body experience, this resonant energy balloon, REBAL, REBAL. So the technique is you visualize this energy flow moving out of the top of your head, around your body, and then back through your feet, right? And so you're not just like visualizing it, you're like creating it, which again, most ancient practices believe that we have the power to do really great things spiritually. So this doesn't throw me for a loop, but this practice of not just visualizing it, but creating it, right, is meant to create like a loop system, like a closed loop of you. So you're making this indigestible, almost like force field almost, right, for any entities that might come while you're out of body. And this whole process is just to try to keep you in this closed loop system so you don't get, you don't get eaten up in there or have something attached to you. And something I found interesting is that directly in these documents, so his name's Lieutenant Colonel McDonnell. He admits in the report that they are simply using the language of theoretical physics to explain what mystics and Eastern sages have known for centuries. I did not know that was in there when I started this whole process. I saw these things occurring. I saw the connection points. When I read that in this, and you can go download it, you can find it anywhere, but, it's just a fancy high-tech Western idea of mystical and Eastern practices that we've known forever, right? They're just putting a new fancy theoretical framework around it, which is awesome. And so, to conclude, I'm going to put some of the ones that I found. So, of course, we're back to frequency, right? And, everyone gets all cheesy and they're like, oh, right? But it has this frequency. And for them, they call it the 7 hertz frequency. So, in this process, you're relying on box breathing and the humming of specific tones, the practitioner. You're trying to hemi-sync the brain, both sides of your brain. So, this is so Buddhist and so like early Vedic Hinduistic, like this chant, right? And breath control. Perfect. Tied that in together, right? So, and this is also where you kind of get this esoteric, like opening the third eye. You're essentially, in scientific terms, you're vibrating the fluid in your brain a specific way that opens this realm up to like a different state of the brain. And so we would call that with modern day, would be like the awakening process. But really in the CIA document, it's just like this electrical charge moving through the body in a way that can literally hum you out. And the other part is Merkaba mysticism, which I thought was cool, right? Dr. Justin Sledge did an entire ascent, and I think he's doing an ascension and descent literature, but he did the Merkaba mysticism. These courses are awesome. I watched all of them. They're like an hour. And not only is it like very Jewish mysticism, but it's also very Egyptian, right? Egyptian schools taught the same thing. So the Merkaba mysticism is like, how do I put this? It's like light, like energy of light, and it like it surrounds you. So the same thing you're doing to protect yourself from any impeding entities is the same as Jewish mystic practices, because the descenders of the chariot, right, who travel through the Hecalot, so Hecalot literature, that's the other one, right? And it says heavenly halls when I was going through that. So while you're going through there, this is protecting the soul from any hostile gatekeepers, right? And again, I put a note here that says sound and look suspiciously like the Archons. So the next one would be like this, they call it Focus 15, where it's a state of no time, right? So past, present, future, they're all accessible. And so this also sounds very, it's like yoga, right? This Tibetan idea of like dreaming, this Milam, right? This dream yoga. And so it's how they practice, like, lucid dreaming, essentially, right? They keep their illusory bodies as they maintain full consciousness during sleep. And so Bardo is the state between death and rebirth, and that's where you get all these deceptive deities and illusions that you have to like navigate. But you need full conscious awareness, right, in your head to be able to navigate these illusions, right, without being tricked or like pulled back into a cycle of reincarnation. And in that report, again, we all talked about the holographic universe. And so that would be what they would call in the document the absolute, right? They describe it as a state of infinite energy with no mass. So essentially a void that is simultaneously everything and nothing, which is very Kabbalah. We've been going through that a little bit. And I did a video on that too. Like, the image is insane, where it's just us in this big void. And we're like, what? Like, you're telling me that we're not even seeing most of the stuff? like, well, throw me out a window. Like, goodness. And again, very Neoplatonic, very Gnostic with the pleroma, right? This fullness, or the one, right? This absolute figure. These are all talked about all the time. Same with Ein Sof, right? Everything and nothing all in itself. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And then there's something that's at least maybe in the West, and like if you're into ghost shows or like the ghost spiritual movies, right? How do you have power over an entity? You got to know its real name. So in the Gateway Materials, Robert Monroe, he notes, even emphasizes, that if you encounter a shadow or predatory entity, you must not show fear. Instead, show a demand for intent, or to perceive their true form, right? So you're knowing their name. So this is very much like esoteric with it, is like Solomon? I'm pretty sure it's Solomon, right? Like you need to know this ancient magic. You have to know their name, like this Solomonic magic. And Egyptians had their true names too. They had like, this is the true name of this demon or spirit. So you only have power if it's underneath you, like emotionally, right? They're controlling you. So by naming it, right, you force itself to reveal any weak points, right? How do I need to know who you are. It makes sense too, right? Like if it's a stranger, I'm like, I don't know you. I know nothing about you. But if I talk to you, ask you your name, hi, I'm Chase, what's your name, right? Now it's like, okay, not strangers anymore. Something does open up, even though it's not visually seen. But again, this does match reports of people who are abducted too, where when they aren't afraid anymore, well, then they just start observing and they're fine. And things start to like lose control, or they start to glitch out. So like there has to be an emotional state you have to be in order for them to do the process they're trying to attempt. And that's kind of the end of the whole connection to this CIA, Gateway project, which then later became Project Stargate, which was remote viewing. So it does have this, I'm not trying to say this is completely true, but that's not what we do. But it is interesting that the work they were doing eventually merged still with remote viewing, which is kind of on the same frequency, wink, wink, of remote viewing. And I went, whoa. So in these, again, that's a whole video in itself of doing this Stargate connection and tying into how this works through. Not planning to do that, but there's a lot of interesting stuff, right? Just Google Joe McMoneagle, Mars, remote viewing, CIA. You're welcome. Excuse me. So to kind of round off and end this, right? I want to leave it maybe with like a sense of hope. Like, excuse me. It's not that we're anything less than these things. We have some type of divine spark, some type of energy, something that makes us unique and makes us here. Now, whether these are like psychological archetypes that we have to like navigate, or real physical interdimensional intelligences that are moving in and out for some, again, remember this, if there's a negative occurrence happening and there has to be balance, right? It means that there's probably also some interdimensional intelligences coming down that are doing good to counteract these things. So it could be way more vast than we could even comprehend, right? We can barely comprehend the idea that the universe is infinite, let alone that there are infinite layers to a universe that are dimensional, that are also infinite, right? Just to think about it blows my brain out the water, right? So either way we're dealing with this, the echoes are still there, right? Doesn't matter who it's from, doesn't matter what tradition, right? There are these weird things that always refer to this system. And maybe we call it UAP in the modern world, but back then they called it the Archons, they called it daimons, they called it, some type of mystical experience that you're coming down, you're learning something from. But I mean, the only way out is to learn about you, develop consciousness, learn to become something other than a number on a spreadsheet, essentially, and work hard at it, right? Like all this stuff, I know this is intense. It's probably one of the longer ones I've done, but I think it's important to drive it home that it is in your hands. You are capable, right? You are important. If you hold on to that and you know that and you keep working through that and moving forward, well then if this is going on, you're going to be almost unfeedable because you're going to know. You're going to be able to discern the difference. And I think that's the conclusion that I think satisfies this intense journey of ancient mystical practices all the way to the UFO phenomenon. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And I will see you next week.